Welcome, this is David Amos Brown, and this video covers AOS Database Interface Controls and the other controls that work with them. So let's begin. Databases are a major source of information and are therefore services. Everything in AOS is simple and straightforward except working with databases because AOS has no control over that domain. AOS is the embodiment of the KISS principle because simpler is just better. The AOS philosophy for SQL is that all interaction with a database can be done with the simple select from where type of SQL statements, and the knowledge required to create these simple SQL statements represents maybe 10% of the whole SQL language, but covers probably 99% of the functionality needed for making programs that work with database data. Fully functional SQL needed in AOS can be learned in 1 hour by anyone. To put it another way, because we have so much power to manipulate information in AOS, we don't need as much flexibility and complication when asking for things from a database. Supporting AOS programmers with SQL instructional content for things like combining tables and SQL queries will be a must to keep things simple. AOS Database Interfaces are services with generic pre-designed service requests that work with database products through the language of SQL. It provides read record, update record, add record, and delete record functions that require only simple information to utilize, and a generic process SQL service request that covers everything SQL. Database controls provide an editor that allows the programmer to select and set up an interface to any of the 7 major database products, which covers about 90% of the world's current databases. It also allows the user to see everything in the database like table field names and data types, which is needed when creating programs. In addition, the editor provides a general SQL processing interface that could be used by AOS programmers new to SQL as a learning and experimentation tool. Let's look at one. This is an AOS Database Interface Control, and as mentioned is a pre-designed service control with an editor for setting up a working connection to one of the 7 major database products. The editor is opened by pressing the space bar. All the driver values for an AOS Database Interface Control are in the Editor Header Settings assembly. Setup is used for defining the values that connect to the selected database product. Services holds the collection of service requests that I mentioned. Current Services Design holds that collection for clients to come get. The Table Explorer allows us to see everything in the database, and the current SQL text shows us what's being shown currently in the SQL result table and is a general interface for issuing SQL commands to the current database. Setting up a database interface begins with the Connections table. The Connections table holds all the information required to connect to the database products listed, as well as the SQL list and view queries used by the Table Explorer. Each entry in the Connections table holds a name you provide for a specific instance of a database product, the database product being used, and a small number of values required to connect. Values in the Connection Settings field can be obtained from your database administrator. The programmer simply replaces the values within the braces. Table Explorer view queries should be copied from the value specified for the database product being used. The current database selection list selects one of the entries of the Connections table. When the selection changes, the Database Interface Control attempts to connect to the selected database to show the user all the current sets of tables. As stated, the Database Interface Control is a service control with 5 generic service requests that cover everything needed to work with the database. The records-based service requests only need simple information to utilize, while the Process SQL service request covers everything within the SQL language. And just like all service controls, the Database Interface Controls stores its designed services assembly in the current service's design and obeys the same security rules. The Table Explorer is a very useful tool in that it allows the programmer to see everything in the database. Selecting a schema fills in the list of tables for the schema and shows all the information for each table. Selecting a table fills in the list of fields from the table and shows all the information for each field. Selecting any of the fields shows the table itself. When the Table Explorer is being used, current SQL text shows the SQL statement that was used to build the SQL result table, but it can also be used to issue any SQL statement to the current database by pressing the Process Current SQL Text button in the header. This makes a database interface control very helpful for learning the SQL language. I selected this table because one of its cells contains an AOS Database Object Control assembly. When a database interface retrieves a table that has large objects in any of its cells, it replaces the object with a database object assembly. In the assembly is all the information needed to get the object on demand by pressing or expressing the Database Object Control's Read button. Database objects are large file-based content that are stored in database table cells and can be any file type. Most database objects are primarily used to hold pictures today because of size. Being file-based, database objects are associated by extension to the program that can open them. Let's take a closer look at one. As you can see, this large object is an MP3 file, which is why it took a second to retrieve. When a database object is replaced with a database object control, the file type is not known, which is why it had to ask for the extension. All the information needed to get the database object is stored in the settings assembly. To get a database object, we need the address of the database interface control, the current database name, the target schema if exists, the target table, the field we're going to search in for the record we want, what to search for in the search field, and once we find the record, what field the object is in. Return status tells us that the object was found or what went wrong. If the database object control is being used as an interface control to view objects in a table we're looking at, the database object address identifies where the database object control to use is located, like the current value of a database object table field. In this mode, the other information is not used. In this database object control over here, we can tell it the file extension beforehand, and only have to press the read button if we have all the other information. Down here, we have a service client that is programmed to use the database process SQL service request. A client works with database interfaces the same way as any other service and are covered in detail in the Services and Clients video. Here we are simply retrieving the ADO data types table. And that is Database Interfaces.